Hi everyone. We are Group 1, and our presentation topic was cancer in the environment, ionizing radiation, and our group members are Saif, Valentina, myself, Samantha N, and Samantha C.
What is ionizing radiation? Ionizing radiation originates from both natural and artificial sources. Naturally, it comes from radioactive elements in the Earth's crust and cosmic rays from space. One significant natural emitter is potassium-40, a radioactive isotope with half-life of 1.3 billion years. In medical diagnostics, ionizing radiation is used in imaging techniques. X-rays expose patients to approximately 0.04 MSV, while CT scans deliver around 8 MSV. In comparison, the average annual exposure to natural background radiation is about 3 MSV. High doses of ionizing radiation have been released during historical events such as atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 and nuclear power plant accidents, including Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima Daiichi and in 2011.
So I chose the paper titled Ionizing Radiation and Cancer Risks, What Have We Learned from Epidemiology? I chose this paper to start because I think it's a great review of research that kind of puts everything into perspective to us for us and explains to us kind of what ionizing radiation really is and how it directly affects our body and why it's important when we're talking about cancer. So, to begin, we will start with some cancer statistics that were spoken of not only in this paper, but that we have also been discussing in our class lectures. Cancer, as we know, is a huge global challenge. Studies show that 40 to 45% of cancer is actually related to preventable risk factors. Most common cancers include, as we've heard in our lecture, lung cancer, breast cancer, and colorectal cancers, and these cancers contribute largely to our cancer related deaths. So, moving on to some epidemiological insights. Much of what we know about radiation and cancer risk comes from epidemiological studies, specifically one that was mentioned in the paper called the Lifespan Study of Japanese Atomic Bomb Survivors. This experiment includes people of all ages and genders and provides decades and decades of data. Essentially, this study has been named the cornerstone for understanding cancer risks tied to ionizing radiation. Now we can move on to some key statistics that may seem very obvious, but I think are very important to note when talking about ionizing radiation. So, according to the statistics in the paper, ionizing radiation is said to be linked to about 2 to 3% of all cancer cases. This means that data clearly shows that there is a dose response relationship, which basically means that if there's a higher concentration of something, there will also be a higher effect. So, in this case, higher radiation equals higher cancer risk, lower radiation equals lower cancer risk. So, this paper also goes into how DNA is affected by radiation, which I think is just even better, a better example of why this paper is so great, because there is a huge correlation with what we're learning in our class and this paper. So we know that radiation causes direct damage to DNA. The most common and most detrimental effect of this is called the double strand break, which is basically says it in the name, both strands of the DNA strand break apart or they break within itself and they become damaged. When these cells fail to correct the double stranded breaks, mutations occur, and these mutations usually occur in TP53 or RB1. As a result of these mutations, normal cell cycle control gets messed up and it leads to cancer. So, for this reason, we should always keep in mind that cancer may not appear until maybe decades or years after being initially exposed. So, the last thing that I wanted to touch on for this paper specifically was the cancer distribution by exposure point that was made in the paper. Basically, the paper talks about and says that the type of cancer that develops usually depends on the magnitude of the exposure and the amount of time that somebody was exposed to the radiation. And they talk about the fact that leukemia typically shows up within 5 to 10 years post exposure, while solid tumors like breast or thyroid cancer take way longer. Tissues also vary by sensitivity, so that also definitely affects the amount of symptoms that you'll see earlier or later, depending on the sensitivity of the tumor.
Radioactive particles in air pollution linked with worse survival in lung cancer patients. In this article, a recent study conducted by researchers at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health suggests that exposure to ambient beta particle radioactivity, a form of ionizing radiation linked to particulate air pollution, may contribute to lower survival rates among lung cancer patients. The study builds upon existing research highlighting the adverse health effects of air pollution by specifically investigating the roles in radioactive particle in disease progression. This article also describes that researchers analyzed data from the Boston lung cancer survival cohort, focusing on patients diagnosed between 2001 and 2017. Using environmental monitoring data, they estimated individual exposure levels to beta particle radioactivity based on residential zip codes. The analysis revealed a significant correlation between the higher exposure levels and reduced survival rates, particularly among early-stage lung cancer patients undergoing treatment. Those exposed to elevated levels of beta radiation experienced lower 3-year and 5-year survival rates, as well as an overall decrease in life expectancy following diagnosis. These findings contribute to the growing body of evidence linking environmental pollutants with adverse health outcomes, reinforcing the necessity for stricter air quality regulations and continued research into the long-term effects of low-dosing ionizing radiation exposure. The study highlights the potential benefits of policy interventions aimed at mitigating air pollution and protecting vulnerable populations, including individuals with pre-existing health conditions such as cancer. In this article called Ionizing Radiation and Health Effects, conducted by the World Health Organization, states that ionizing radiation is a form of energy emitted by atoms in the form of electromagnetic waves, such as X-rays and gamma rays, or subatomic particles such as alpha and beta particles. The type of radiation has sufficient energy to remove electrons from atoms and molecules in a process known as ionization. Ionizing radiation is present in both natural and human-made sources. Naturally occurring sources include radioactive elements in soil, water, and vegetation, as well as cosmic rays from outer space. Human-made sources primarily include medical diagnostic and therapeutic procedures such as X-rays, CT scans, and radiotherapy, nuclear power generation, and certain industrial applications. This article also explains that exposure to ionizing radiation can have various health effects, which depend on the dose, duration, and type of radiation exposure. High doses of radiation received in a short period can cause acute health effects such as radiation burns, radiation sickness, acute radiation syndrome, and in extreme cases, death. These effects are typically associated with the events such as nuclear accidents or radiation exposure in occupational settings without proper protection. In contrast, prolonged or repeated exposure to low doses of ionizing radiation can lead to long-term health effects, risks, and the most important being an increased likelihood of developing cancer. Ionizing radiation can cause DNA damage, which, if not properly repaired by the body, may lead to mutations and malignancies over time.
So the next paper that we're going to talk about is titled Molecular Mechanism of Carcinogenesis Induced by Low Dose and High Dose Radiations. So as I mentioned before, we see that radiation is a dose response. So like I mentioned, high concentration equals high effect and low concentration equals low effect. So this paper talks a little bit more about it, and we're going to get into that now. So carcinogenesis by ionizing radiation. Both the LDIR and the HDIR affect the normal function of cells. LDIR generally demonstrates adaptive responses from cells as more secondary dose is received. However, HDIR and LET ionization radiations have bidirection radiobiological effects which can induce carcinogenesis by introducing single-strand and double-strand DNA breaks and affect DNA repair pathways. Ionizing radiations are a double-edged sword. When given in controlled dosages, their DNA damaging and DNA repair capabilities are harnessed for radiation therapy of cancers. So just reinforcing basically that ionizing radiation causes double-stranded breaks, and we will go into a little bit more detail about what double-stranded breaks are. I know I went into it a little bit earlier, but we go into a little bit more detail in a little bit. So you may be asking now, what is LDIR-induced carcinogenesis? So there are two components to this. The first one being LDIR-induced signal transduction abnormalities. LDIR is a stimulating factor, and it introduces ethylation or phosphorylation of signal transduction proteins, and this affects the gene expression and transcription and controls growth, cell growth, and differentiation. Then we have LDIR-induced ROS. So LDIR induces ROS, which is a hydrogen peroxide and hydroxyl radical, and this basically destroys the whole cell and it leads to apoptosis. This ROS damages vital cellular components and modifies the proteins and lipids and destroys the structure and function that induces epigenetic alterations and silences tumor-suppressing genes. Having long exposure to oxidative stress and tumor microenvironment. So basically, just like we've been talking about this whole time, the more that you put these cells under the exposure of radiation, the more effect that it will have on the cell. So we see that in the ROS, they're completely destroyed. The whole proteins, all the lipids, everything is completely destroyed. Now you may be asking, what is HDIR? HDIR is what induces the DNA breaks that we were talking about throughout this whole PowerPoint. So ionizing radiation induces the various forms of DNA damage, including the base changes, single-stranded breaks, double-stranded breaks, and DNA cross-linkages. Double-stranded breaks specifically compromise the internal structure of DNA and lead to the genomic instability. High doses of this ionizing radiation cause increased denaturation of DNA strands, resulting in the accumulation of mutations and chromosomal aberrations. This type of damage is often beyond repair and can drive oncogenesis. Oncogenesis is just the formation of tumors. And then the main repair pathways involved in the DNA repair system include non-homologous end joining, homologous end joining, and base excision repair. In these pathways, cells can repair their DNA and progress through specific checkpoints in the cell cycle. However, cells can skip these checkpoints, and the ones that do undergo abnormal proliferation, leading to tumor development. So now that we've gone over the high dosage and the low dosage of ionizing radiation, now we can talk about its effect on miRNA. So microRNAs are non-coding RNAs that regulate gene expression after transcription. As we were talking about before, we know already that ionizing radiation affects transcription and kind of stunts it from continuing, right? So exposure to ionizing radiation impacts the expression of the mRNAs, which can have both beneficial and also detrimental consequences, one of them being potential development of cancer. So the upregulation of these mRNAs due to the X-ray irradiation can activate tumor suppressor genes and inhibit tumor cell formation. Conversely, the upregulation of oncogenic mRNAs can silence tumor suppressor genes, leading to uncontrolled cell proliferation and ultimately cancer. So a common trend that we see throughout this whole ionizing radiation project is that ionizing radiation has both positive and negative effects. So just to finish off this paper, we're going to go into the IR-induced gastrointestinal tumorigenesis. So gastrointestinal cells are continuously replenished and replaced by new stem cells. IR disrupts the balance between cell proliferation and cell death along specifically the crypt-villus axis. This axis is essential for keeping tissues healthy and pure. This IR kills stem cells, causing delays in their replacement and leads to the mutation of normal cells into cancerous cells. Damage to the stem cells initiates malignant transformation, which is a common pathway to colorectal cancer. Research in the paper found that survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings had gastrointestinal cancer that as the third most common solid tumor. Space scientists are particularly concerned about the presence of cosmic radiation in space. So for missions to Mars, the risk of developing colorectal cancer may exceed NASA's safety threshold of 3%.
Hi everyone, please excuse my voice. I lost my voice a few days ago. I'm gonna dive into the risk to public health and molecular effects of ionizing radiation. We're gonna go over a few things like carcinogen, prolonged exposure, and the development of cancer, how radiation affects molecular pathways, and the methods of lowering risk and exposure. Moving on to this next slide, it is necessary that you all understand what we're dealing with before we dive into all of the technical details. The National Toxicology Program report on carcinogens, which was also known as the gold standard for identifying chemicals that cause cancer, formally lists ionizing radiation as a recognized human carcinogen. The fact that it has enough energy to remove electrons from atoms is what makes it so deadly. At first, it might not seem like much, but it leads to ionization, which can seriously damage your cells, particularly your DNA. Additionally to that, certain types of DNA damage can set off a series of events that ultimately result in cancer. So the fact that ionization radiation originates from both natural and man-made sources is extremely important. This is why we're discussing stuff like natural occurring radioactivity elements on Earth or cosmetic rays from space. However, there are also things that humans have produced, such as nuclear power plants, X-ray machines, and even radiation from specific medical procedures. It's more common than we really think, despite the fact that it seems like something you only hear about in scientific fiction. So moving on to this next slide, one of my main worries about ionizing radiation isn't really about getting a huge dose all at once. Rather, it's about consequences of low-level radiation, long-term exposure that we don't typically consider day to day. This type of radiation accumulates over time and can dramatically raise your risk of getting cancer. Leukemia, thyroid, lung, and even breast cancer have all been connected to it. This is a really scary thing that many of these exposures might occur gradually over years and from common places. Consider those who are exposed to radiation at work or even receive regular medical examining without being aware of the long-term effects of what's going on. Adding on to that, not everyone is at the same risk. You may be more or less vulnerable depending on the factors that go on in your life, including age, your general health, your genetic makeup, your everyday lifestyle. For instance, because cells divide more quickly, children and pregnant women are more vulnerable. Additionally, because radiation damages DNA, the more quickly those cells divide, the more likely they are to replicate those errors and develop into cancer. So this slide is going to dive a little bit more into the biological aspect of the situations, showing how ionizing radiation truly disrupts your body at the molecular level. It creates a double-strand break in DNA, which is one of the main problems. If you think about your DNA as like a zipper, picture it being cut in two, and your body finds it extremely difficult to properly repair a double-strand break like that. So use the zipper as more of a visual, but when it occurs, it can set up a process or processes that result in cancer, particularly if critical genes are altered or turned off. The P53 gene, which is essential for your body's stop sign for abnormal cell growth, is a really good example. It can be affected by radiations, and cells can proliferate uncontrollably when P5 is dysfunctional. Oxidative stress is going to be another major effect of radiation. This occurs when dangerous molecules known as free radicals are released into the cell, and they begin to disrupt other components such as proteins, membranes, and even more DNA. This eventually produces a somewhat disorganized environment in the body that facilitates with the development and spread of cancer throughout your body. So on the better hand, there are steps that we can do to safeguard ourselves from radiation. The first one is fairly self-explanatory, just to stay out of the spotlight. This includes avoiding unnecessary CT scans and x-rays unless your doctor says they're absolutely necessary. If not, you definitely should shy away from that. Although the majority of doctors already attempt to keep this at a minimum, it is acceptable to speak up for yourself and let them know that you're trying to avoid these things. So radiant gas is an extremely underappreciated source of radiation. In fact, it's the second most common cause of lung cancer in the United States after smoking. This radioactive gas is found naturally and can seep into your house, particularly in basements or wherever that gas chamber is. The weird thing is that you can't see it or smell it. So testing the air is the only proper method to find out if it's present. There are reasonable priced methods to lower your levels if they are pretty high. Additionally, people who work in fields like healthcare or areas that are going to expose them to radiation, they must adhere to extremely significant safety protocols. This covers wearing protective clothing, monitoring exposure over time, and employee shielding. It all comes down to minimizing the dosage while still completing your necessary daily tasks.
Okay, so the last paper that we're discussing is called Ionizing Radiation Induced Cancer, Perplexities of the Bystander Effect. So this paper was probably my favorite paper to read throughout this whole project because it kind of thinks a little bit more outside the box in the sense that they found that DNA is not the only concept that is important when we're talking about cancer. So, despite everything that we discussed throughout the presentation about ionizing radiation, the full picture and the full research about how IR leads to cancer is still incomplete. The biggest challenge and stunt in this type of research is, like we mentioned before, the long and unpredictable latency periods that occur between the exposure of radiation and the symptoms of radiation. This suggests that more than just DNA could possibly and very well be at play when we're talking about apoptosis, when we're talking about cancer markers, when we're talking about how cancer develops and how it spreads. So the main concept that this paper mentioned was the bystander effect. From what I understood, the bystander effect basically is when there's a biological response to non-irradiated cells that are near irradiated ones. So for example, we talk about secondhand smoke. So like if you are around someone that's smoking, when babies are around parents that smoke or that have smoked while they were pregnant, like they are more likely to be affected by the secondhand smoke than someone who isn't around those types of toxins, right? So these effects can most likely be driven by signaling molecules like reactive oxygen species and cytokines. This points to an even bigger and more complex explanation to the responses our bodies have on radiation, because you really never know what is around you and what is in the air, because a lot of these toxins we can't even see. So it's really interesting that this is like such a huge thing that could be affecting our bodies every day. So the last thing that I want to touch on about the bystander effect is that after dissecting the paper, we found that overall the bystander effect does have some pretty big implications because it can worsen radiation or it could actually trigger protective mechanisms. We see in hospitals cancer patients are treated with radiation sometimes. So understanding the radiation itself can better help scientists refine how we use radiation in cancer therapy and kind of tailor it a little bit better to be able to exploit the negative effects. Some ways that we could do this are probably like tailoring the doses or even combining the treatments, just like we do chemo and radiation. Finding other ways to use radiation to our advantage. But yeah. So what we learned from this whole project as a whole is that ionizing radiation is a dose-dependent response. There are two kinds. There's high dosage ionizing radiation and low dosage ionizing radiation. Both of these doses affect transcription. DNA breaks, we know that there's two types, miRNA and gastrointestinal cells, and that there is still a lot of unknowns, so that there's still research that can be done to find about secondhand, about bystander effects, all of the sorts. But basically what we understand is that ionizing radiation could be great or it could be terrible for the body, but it's best to err on the side of caution and overall just kind of make sure that everything is in moderation and that you're definitely putting on your sunscreen, staying away from the light, only using the amount of dosages that you need that are absolutely necessary in medical settings, in pharmaceutical settings, in all of the settings. So yeah, I hope that you guys learned a lot from our PowerPoint, and we really appreciate you listening to us. And then last but not least, these are our references. All of our papers are peer reviews, and they are also either primary literature or review of research. This was a very interesting project to do, and we're so grateful that we were able to present to you all. Thank you so much for listening.